You're listening to the latest episode of the Verbatim Word Podcast, where we seek biblical truth in a daily context. This is Justin Gary. There's nothing quite like enjoying the great outdoors. When my wife and I used to live in Slovenia as missionaries, we loved going outside and just enjoying all the natural beauty that nation offered. One of our favorite things we liked to do was to go biking. Now, Slovenia is quite a hilly country, especially when you come from a place like Oklahoma, which is very, very flat, and we'd spend a lot of our time biking up hills. Now, some of these hills took quite a bit of time to climb up. I mean, we're talking an hour or 2 hours of constant climbing, constant pedaling in your lowest gears, going up, gaining altitude the whole time. You're going at a snail's pace. Someone could probably almost walk faster than you're going uphill, pedaling your bike up those hills. It was a slow way of getting to the top. But once you got there and you finally crested at the very peak, the way down was all downhill. In fact, a 90-minute ride uphill could get you down in about 10 or 15 minutes. It was easy riding, barely any pedaling, because the force of gravity would bring you down. All those feet in elevation you climbed, now you're reaping the benefit of gravity. It was exciting going down, it was rewarding, it was fast-paced, it was pretty exhilarating to rocket down that mountain. Climbing uphill was one thing, going downhill was a much better thing. Here's some encouragement for you. If you've made it this far in the Verbatim Word Podcast, congratulations. It's not been an easy climb in Galatians. It's been an uphill climb. Paul has given us some very challenging and theological texts to climb through. A lot of Old Testament law, insights into Judaism. It has not been light fare. The good news, though, is we are almost there. Hang in there, we're about to crest at the peak because we're finishing chapter 4 today. And chapters 5 and 6 are really all about application. That was usually the way that Paul wrote his epistles. The first portion of the book, he laid out these theological truths, and then the second half of the book, he was explaining to them how they could then apply these things. We're almost at the peak. We're in the final climb. We're pedaling in our lowest gear to finish chapter 4, and then we're going to get into some great and highly applicable parts of Scripture coming soon. And most of the hard work of pedaling through Paul's text is behind us, and we'll get to enjoy a little bit as we go down in the second half of the book. Now, chapter 4 is the final push. So Paul is really making a closing argument in the section that we're going to read today before giving some application. On our last podcast, Paul got up and close and personal with the Galatians. He was reminiscing about how he came to them out of his own physical infirmity. And now he was concerned that some of them were taking the first steps back to being slaves to the law, even though they had something better in a child-father relationship that comes through the new covenant of grace. Paul, too, was surprised that the Galatians were being wooed by these false teachers who they did not know very well, and they were doubting him who they knew so personally. On this episode, Paul uses a familiar Old Testament story as a final illustration to pull them back from the edge of making a spiritual decision to return to the law that Paul knows that they will regret. We pick up in Galatians chapter 4, starting in verse 21. We've all been told before, be careful what you ask for. I remember hearing the story of King Midas when I was growing up. King Midas loved his riches, and he erroneously assumed that he'd be happy with more. So one day he wished, and he got his wish, that everything that he touched would turn to gold. When he woke up from his bed that morning, the first thing he did, he touched the table. The entire table turned to gold. Well, in his excitement, he began running around his palace, touching everything and watching it turn to the valuable gold that he so much desired. But then as he continued going about his day and touching different things, certain things turned to gold that he wasn't so certain were a good thing to turn to gold, like the food that he'd once enjoyed, or the drink that he drank, or even the rose in his garden that he touched that eventually quickly lost its scent because it was now of a different form, being gold. But we know the tragic part of that story is when his daughter ran into the room and she came to embrace him. And as he touched her, his own daughter turned to gold. It's a tragedy sometimes to get what we ask for. In Paul's final push to persuade the Galatians, he asks them if they really know what they're contemplating. and warns them to be careful what they ask for. Beginning in Galatians chapter 4, verse 21, Paul says there, "Tell me, you who desire to be under the law, do you not hear the law?" He asked the Galatians, had they really considered the implications of what they were asking for? This is the problem in man. We choose what we think is best for us, which is often in contrast to what God says is best for us. We make our own decisions based upon our own wisdom and our own foresight, and we try it out ourselves. Perhaps you've had someone say to you before, "Oh, gross, smell this," and you go and smell it. Or, "Ooh, taste this, it tastes bad," and you go ahead and taste that. Why do we need to smell it? Why do we need to taste it? They've already told us it's not worth it. Sin is not bad because it's forbidden. Sin is forbidden because it's bad. God has determined that that is not good for us, so he tells us stay away from these things, and we're supposed to trust him at his word. Now, Paul is saying, you who desire to be under the law, do you not hear the law? Do you really know what it is you're going back to? Paul says God has given us a new covenant for a reason. You don't need to try it out yourself to find out that it's not worth it. But they were listening to outside influencers instead, to these Judaizers, and their message was the law is better in their opinion. And the reason why they thought the law is better is, first of all, it seemed a little bit easier. It offered a checklist of rules to keep. Second of all, if you're under the law, you can feel good about yourself because you can pat yourself on the back and say, you're better than others. In fact, it's kind of competitive because in comparison to other people, you're probably keeping the law a little bit better. And finally, number three, you can pat yourself on the back for your own salvation because you earned it under the law by keeping all the rules that you had on your list. Paul says it may seem good on the outside, but it's really not worth it. He says, don't be misled. Tell me, you who desire to be under the law, do you not hear the law? Paul, in this closing argument in this section, gives them something from the law, a story that all those who study the law would know clearly. It has to do with Abraham, the hero of their faith. Now, when he begins mentioning Abraham, Paul's doing a little bit of name dropping here. We all love to name drop. If we have a connection or if we feel that a certain person that we might know will get us a foot in the door, we'll drop that name conveniently for our benefit. My wife lived in LA for a period of her life, and she worked with someone on a famous TV show that aired in the 2000s before that person booked that role on that TV show. She has shared with me stories of how they hung out, of conversations they had, of just about this friendship that they had in that season before they booked the TV show. Now, whenever that show comes up, I name drop. I say, oh yeah, my wife, she's friends with that person. She knows that person. We all do it if we can. We can make a connection to someone that we mutually know, or if it's a personal benefit to us. That's exactly what Paul is doing here. He's like, hey, you remember Abraham? He's doing some name dropping here to open the door in this final push to get them to understand what he's trying to say. He had no qualms about name dropping Abraham. It would get the attention of his audience because for the Judaizers, Abraham was the father of their faith. God originated the promise that culminated in the law through Abraham. So the story that he chooses, it unfolds throughout the book of Genesis. But particularly the section we look at today, it kind of peaks in Genesis chapter 16 and Genesis chapter 21. But let's look at an overview of this story real quick. The timeline goes like this. Abraham is called out of his nation, Ur of the Chaldeans, when he is 75 years old, promised that if he'll obey that God will make him a blessing to all the world. Now, shortly after he gets there to the land of Canaan, there's a famine in the land. And even though God has called him to stay in Canaan, Abraham freaks out a little bit with the lacking resources and he goes down to Egypt. Once he's there, he lies a little bit. He has Sarah lie about being his sister instead of his wife. And God ends up protecting and blessing them anyway. But they come back in a little bit of shame back from Egypt to the land of Canaan. But they come with riches and they also come with additional people with them, some servants. One of those servants that comes back with them from Egypt is a handmaiden for Sarah named Hagar. Now, in chapter 15 of the book of Galatians, they've returned now from Egypt. God makes some promises, and he brings Abraham outside underneath the night sky, and he says, look at all those stars. If you can believe it, you'll have as many descendants as the stars in the sky. And Abraham believes God, and it's accredited to him for righteousness. So it's kind of the beginning of this covenant here. Well, it's been a number of years, about 11 years, and the story picks up, and Abraham is now 86 years old, and he still has no child. But God has promised that he wants to bless the world through the descendants of Abraham. So Sarah, she's still called Sarai at the time, Sarai is wanting with good intentions to help her husband and help God's promise along. So she says, why don't you take my handmaiden Hagar, and why don't you go ahead and have a child with her, and I'll go ahead and raise that child as my own, and we'll just help God and we'll fulfill this promise. So Abraham agrees, and he and Hagar have a child, and that child is named Ishmael. Now, shortly after the birth of this child, Hagar begins to despise Sarah, and there's a conflict there in the household. God says, you know what, Ishmael, that's not the one. And he repeats his promise again there in Genesis chapter 17, and he adds circumcision to it as the sign of the covenant, saying, Abraham, I'm going to do this. I want you to be set apart from everything else on earth. Then after a supernatural visit, he repeats his promise again and says, within a year's time, you and Sarah will have a child. Well, Sarah, who's eavesdropping there, she begins to laugh. And they say, you're going to name the child Isaac, which means laughter, because we're going to prove it to you. You're going to have the child of promise. A year later, Abraham is 100 years old, 25 years after he initially left Ur of the Chaldees, and he has his own child, Isaac, with his wife, Sarah. And it's a miracle because they're both barren. Well, Hagar and Ishmael aren't too happy about this. In fact, Ishmael, at 14 years old, is caught mocking his younger brother, Isaac. And at that point in the story, Hagar and Ishmael are sent off because they are not the family of promise. Ishmael is not the son of promise. What a story. And what a picture of the father of faith. And it's not a very pristine picture. The Bible is faithful to show us flaws of people. All the heroes that we read about, they all fall short in some way. And there's a reason for that. Because we know that we need a Messiah and that there's no one righteous, no, not one, even our heroes of the faith. It's kind of like the law. We've been reading that the law points us to our need for Jesus. Same thing when we read the stories of these people of faith in the Bible and all their imperfections, it points us to Jesus as well. Even the heroes of the law, they were not demigods or super saints. They were flawed people who needed God and who needed a savior as well. And God worked in spite of their poor choices or weak character to do his work in spite of them, so God gets the glory. You know, God knows no such thing as a cancel culture. Yes, we have to live with the repercussions of our choices, just like Abraham had to live with Ishmael. But God's grace can forgive and redeem those things that we've done in our past. Paul knew it himself firsthand. He should have been canceled. There should have been a cancel culture over Paul's life. But when we are saved, our past is not canceled. God redeems our past. I remember when I was first saved and I was going to church, I used to love hearing good testimonies, quote unquote, the good ones. They were usually the good testimonies were the ones, the badder the person was, the more drugs they had used, the more violent, the more promiscuous they had been. Those were the good testimonies. Those were the better testimonies. The truth is, we all have a good testimony because we're all forgiven because Jesus is good and we are not. And God never cancels a testimony. God never cancels a life that has come to him. And Abraham was no exception. That is the story that Paul brings up. He writes to them in Galatians 4, verses 22 and 23. For it is written that Abraham had two sons, the one by a bondwoman, the other by a free woman. But he who was of the bondwoman was born according to the flesh, and he of the free woman through promise. Paul is going to use these two sons of Abraham as an illustration to the Galatians. One representing them if they go to the law, as the Judaizers were promoting, which would have been Hagar and Ishmael, and one representing them if they stay under grace, which was represented by Sarah and Isaac. The bondwoman. Hagar was the maid, she was the servant, and Ishmael was born into that. Slavery could be inherited from your parents. So Ishmael was born into slavery. Even though he was the son of Abraham, he was still a slave because of his mother's identity, because of his mother's role in society. This is bringing up again the topic of bondage that Paul has brought up before. Now, the other one, Isaac, those born of Isaac, Isaac was free. He was born to two free parents, to Abraham and to Sarah. And so there was a freedom that came from that, which again is pointing to the fact if you come to God under promise, you are not under the bondage of the law. Now notice, both Ishmael and Isaac had the same dad. They shared half of their DNA together. In fact, they maybe even have had similar features. Maybe they shared Abraham's nose or his eyes or his big toe that was kind of unique. There might have been some kind of resemblance between Ishmael and Isaac, but they held completely different status in the home. One was a slave and one was free. Now, as Paul makes this parallel to faith, not all faith is the same. The legalism and the grace were quite different. The legalism was bondage, the grace was freedom. Now, an outsider might look and say, well, they're all religious, right? And they're all worshiping the same God. But in essence, they're quite different with implications for their future and how this faith would play out. There's been a training that I've gone through in the last few years in education. It's called trauma-informed education. And basically, it means that the environment that a person has been raised in or the circumstances that they've had to face, especially early in life, can have long-lasting impact. In fact, there's something called an ACE score. It's Adverse Childhood Experiences. And based upon this survey that you take, if the child or if you've gone through a divorce when you were younger, or one of your parents was in prison, or if there's alcoholism in the home, or if you and your family were ever homeless, things like that, there's different criteria. And based upon your score gives you your ACE score. And if you have a certain ACE score, you could have long-lasting implications upon yourself in society, as well as upon your mental abilities and upon your behavior and lots of other different things that it plays out in. In the spiritual environment, this plays out as well. If you've been raised in a very legalistic background, even though you may have been set free from that and you've come to understand God's grace, you might still struggle today with God's grace. I know someone that every now and then they'll say, do you think that God's going to do this or this because maybe a poor decision that they just made? And sometimes they'll sarcastically say, oh, that sounds like the God of the Bible, meaning that is not the God that we serve. We are not under the law. We are under grace. Now, God sometimes will let us live with the repercussions of our choices. Just like Ishmael, Abraham had to live with that decision and all the repercussions of that. But it's so easy to fall back into legalistic thinking, isn't it? Ishmael and Isaac look similar, potentially, but one was a slave and one was free. In the same way, the Galatians could not just say, well, both the law and grace give opportunity to relate to God, so does it really matter which one we relate to God under? Or, well, they both mention Jesus, but pursuing one or the other would have implications on them as they move forward in that. If they pursued the law, they would be slaves and bondage. If they pursued grace, then they would be set free. In addition to the slave and free status mentioned, verse 23 says this, but he who was born of the bondwoman was born according to the flesh, and he of the free woman through promise. The origin of these two sons. One was born of the flesh, meaning that Abraham made that happen. Sarah suggested it, Abraham and Hagar went through with it, but they made it happen. It was according to their own initiative, on their own resources, and in the end, they could really get credit for this plan. The other one came through promise. Isaac came because God did it, and only God could get the glory. Abraham and Sarah were barren in those years, and the fact that they had a child was really a miracle. It happened in his way and in his timing, and that happened according to promise. Now, when it comes to any set of program or any religion or any faith that promotes salvation through works, we get the credit. In contrast to being able to say, Jesus saved me. That anyone can be saved is truly a miracle. And when someone gets saved, born again in Jesus Christ through promise, each time it happens, something happens in heaven. If you look in Luke chapter 15, it's mostly known for the story of the prodigal son, but there's two other parables in there. One is of the lost sheep and of the lost coins. And it says this: when the person finds what they're looking for, it says, likewise, they say to you, there is joy in the presence of all the angels of God over one sinner who repents. Did you notice that in heaven, when a sinner repents, the angels in the presence of God, there is so much joy there. It's kind of like when you're at a restaurant and someone has a birthday and all the wait staff and the cooking staff stop what they're doing and they come and sing happy birthday to whoever has a happy birthday or whoever is having a birthday. Even more so in heaven. When a sinner on earth repents, all of heaven seems to stop. And all the angels, no matter what they're doing in their heavenly glory around the throne, they stop and they rejoice over one sinner who repents. It's a big deal when someone is saved because it's a miracle that each time one is saved by grace. Were the Galatians wanting to leave God out of the equation and the story of their own salvation, being able to take credit for themselves because they were going to go relate to God by the law? Or were they going to be able to say, Jesus saved me? It was his choice, it was his action, and I simply entered into that agreement by faith and through grace. Paul points out that he is using these two symbolically for the two covenants. Ishmael and Hagar as the law, and Sarah and Isaac as grace. And now he uses two known mountains, Mount Sinai, where the law was given, and Jerusalem, which sits upon Mount Zion, where Jesus died, to solidify the contrast between the law and grace in verses 24 through 26. It says this, beginning in verse 24, which things are symbolic? For these are the two covenants, the one from Mount Sinai, which gives birth to bondage, which is Hagar. For this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia and corresponds to Jerusalem, which now is and is in bondage with her children. But the Jerusalem above is free, which is the mother of us all. Paul really wants to make sure they understand just how much of a bummer it would be to go back to the law. In verse 24, he mentions Mount Sinai in Arabia. The law was given there, and it was not a pretty memory to reflect back upon. We read the story back in Exodus chapter 19, verses 16 through 21, when the law was given. It says this, then it came to pass on the third day in the morning that there were thunderings and lightnings. I live in Oklahoma. Storms can be pretty scary. And a thick cloud on the mountain. It was dark. It was gloomy. It was foreboding. And the sound of the trumpet was very loud. It was deafening. So that all the people who were in the camp trembled. Imagine, kids are crying, parents are cowering in the corner. And Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Man, I never got called to the principal's office, but I can imagine what that was like. They were just waiting for lightning to strike, I am sure. Now, Mount Sinai was completely in smoke because the Lord descended upon it in fire. Its smoke ascended like the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mountain quaked greatly. Oh, now we're adding earthquakes to the situation. And when the blast of the trumpet sounded long, it became louder and louder. Man, talk about growing in intensity, this increasing sound. Moses spoke, and God answered him by voice. Then the Lord came down upon Mount Sinai on the top of the mountain, and the Lord called Moses to the top of the mountain, and Moses went up. And the Lord said to Moses, go down and warn the people, lest they break through to gaze upon the Lord, and many of them perish. This whole scenario is deadly and dangerous. Paul says that is what you want to go back to? A law that clearly showed how far you were from God and that you would never be welcome in his presence and that you needed to fear him because you, a fallen creation, a sinner, could never be in the presence of a holy God? Now, not only does it correspond to Mount Sinai, he says that that woman, Hagar the slave, brought us into bondage, and that Jerusalem, the Judaizers actually came from there, and all her children were still in bondage to that very day, except for those who were born again in the new covenant. Paul may be a little biased here, but he knew how bad it had been under the law and wanted to keep them from going in that direction. In contrast, though, Paul points them to another place in verse 26. He says, but the Jerusalem above is free, which is the mother of us all. In Paul's day, many of the religious people in Jerusalem were still stuck in the law, but there was another Jerusalem to consider. First, Jerusalem. It's the city of peace. Jerusalem rests on Mount Zion, and in particular, there's a mountain named Mount Moriah there. It's kind of like Mount Zion would be like the Appalachians, but then Mount Moriah might be a particular peak or a particular area there in those mountains. So you had Mount Zion and Mount Moriah. Now, some key things happened there on Mount Zion and on Mount Moriah in particular. For example, when Abraham was tested and he offered up his son as a sacrifice, but God provided the ram as a substitutionary sacrifice, that took place there, Mount Zion, Mount Moriah. David offered up an offering to stop the plague on the threshing floor there, and God accepted that offering. That took place on Mount Zion and on Mount Moriah. The temple was built on Mount Zion, Mount Moriah. Jesus was crucified on Mount Moriah, on Mount Zion, in that same area. The contrast here, you have Mount Sinai, where there was the thundering and you were told to keep away from God. And then there's Jerusalem, Mount Zion, Mount Moriah, where God continually had sacrifice present or sacrifice offered in order to make that reconciliation with man. There's an analogy between the two. Mount Sinai demanded perfection, fear of God, and separation. And Mount Zion, and more specifically Mount Moriah, the key peak, consistently spoke of sacrifice and forgiveness, something that Jesus ultimately fulfilled. The second, Jerusalem, would be preferred. But Paul spoke there in verse 26 of Jerusalem above is free. We refer to Revelation chapter 21. John sees a new Jerusalem descending like a bride adorned for her husband. And John writes this, "And I heard a loud voice from heaven saying, 'Behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he will dwell with them, and they shall be his people. God himself will be with them and be their God. And God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There shall be no more death, no more sorrow, nor crying. There shall be no more pain, for the former things have passed away.'" Let's stop there for a second. How comforting is that? How inviting is that? Such a contrast from what took place on Mount Sinai when the old law was given. And John goes on to say there in Revelation 21, "But I saw no temple in it," no temple in this new Jerusalem, "for the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb are its temple. The city had no need of the sun or the moon or of the sun or the moon to shine in it, for the glory of God illuminated it. The Lamb is its light. And the nations of those who are saved shall walk in its light, and the kings of the earth bring their glory and honor into it. Its gates shall not be shut at all by day. There shall be no night there. And they shall bring the glory and the honor of the nations into it. But there shall by no means enter into it anything that defiles or causes an abomination or a lie, but only those who are written in the Lamb's book of life." How welcoming is this new Jerusalem that comes from above? And it's a contrast to Mount Sinai, which basically said, "Go away." Now, some people look and think there must be two different gods in the Bible, a God of the Old Testament and a God of the New Testament. What explains this Jekyll and Hyde reception of Exodus chapter 19 there on Mount Sinai in contrast to Revelation 21, which God seems to be so inviting? The contrast there, the point is there, it's Jesus. In one of them, we come on our own merit, and that's an offense to God. He says, "Get away. I don't want you coming in your own righteousness." That is an offense. That is disgusting to me. In the other, we have put on Jesus, and we are welcome at home. Paul says, "What welcome do you want, Galatians?" I pity those who believe God will accept them on their good works. They believe, "Oh, me and God will have a good conversation," or "I'll just make amends with the man upstairs when I go face him." Unfortunately, they will probably hear, "Depart from me, all you workers of iniquity." Such a tragedy, because it is wholly unnecessary. There is room enough in heaven for those who believe in faith. But if you insist on approaching God by works, your works will never be enough. You will be denied entry. Paul has another verse to throw their way, this time quoting from the Old Testament prophet Isaiah. In Galatians chapter 4, verse 27, it's written, "For it is written, 'Rejoice, O barren, you who do not bear. Break forth and shout, you who are not in labor. For the desolate has many more children than she who has a husband.'" The prophet uses an image of a woman who is barren. She has tried, but she cannot conceive, which was a shameful thing in their culture and even inconvenient and unfortunate on a practical level because that means you had no one to take care of you. There was no social security in the future. But this prophecy says that the one who is barren will end up more fruitful. He's going back again to Hagar and Sarah. The one who could not have a child, Sarah, she only had Isaac in the end. But she ended up much more fruitful because she had the Messiah in her lineage, through whom all the world will be blessed. The gospel was going forth as Paul was writing these words. As many as believed in faith, they had the right to be called children of God. This is in contrast to those who were holding on to Judaism, which was dying off because it didn't bring life. People were being drawn to the life-giving presence and spirit of the true gospel, and they were being quenched in their pursuit of righteousness underneath the law. And Paul points out that this was prophesied. Not all Gentiles needed to come under the law. It's a unique time in history. Right now, God is working through the church, the Gentile church, to be his agent in the world, to be his light in this world. This does not mean that he has forsaken the nation of Israel. I believe he will start the clock once again. Many of the end times prophecies really literally speak of the nation of Israel. If you think about it, we mentioned on the last podcast, they're back in the land. God is ready to hit the pause button and work with them once again. But for now, as Paul writes, rejoice, O barren, you who do not bear, for the desolate has many more children than she who has a husband. Ever since the gospel of grace, ever since the gospel of promise, the gospel has been going out into all the world. Every tribe, every tongue, every nation, there will be people there in heaven who have received that. What a contrast to the law, which does not bring life. So Paul proposes his ultimatum to the Galatians in the next verses. What side of this issue are you going to get on? He asks. He says in verses 28 through 31, now we, brethren, as Isaac was, are children of promise. But as he who was born according to the flesh then persecuted him who was born according to the Spirit, even so it is now. Nevertheless, what does the Scripture say? Cast out the bondwoman and her son, for the son of the bondwoman shall not be heir with the son of the free woman. So then, brethren, we are not children of the bondwoman, but of the free. Paul knew that these Galatians were conflicted in their decision, partly from the pressure of the Judaizers. But Paul also recognizes that that pressure had been going on for a long time. As Paul writes in verse 29, but as he who was born according to the flesh then persecuted him who was born according to the Spirit, even so it is now. Talk about sibling rivalry. The strife between the two moms, Hagar and Sarah, bled over into the Ishmael giving Isaac a hard time. And Paul says that that was still happening in their day, because those of the law, like the Judaizers, were critical and persecuting those who were under the grace of the new covenant of promise. When they saw them experiencing this life under the grace of the new covenant, they persecuted them. They said, no, that's too easy. No, you're not in the right. No, there's something else you need to add on to that. Robbing and stealing away the joy that they were supposed to be having in that relationship with God. That's the pressure that the Galatians were feeling, like they were not doing enough to earn God's favor. If the Galatians and Judaizers were doubting Paul's views on this matter, they shouldn't, because Paul is only pointing out something that Scripture had already said to them. In the story of Hagar and Ishmael and Sarah and Isaac, God finally gave these instructions to Abraham, and Paul quotes it there in the verses. Cast out the bondwoman and her son, for the son of the bondwoman shall not be heir with the son of the free woman. What a tough step of obedience that must have been for Abraham. Ishmael was his son after all, his first son. But in God's plan, God was not going to work with Ishmael. Ishmael was Abraham's doing, Abraham's choice, Abraham's efforts. It was a work of Abraham's flesh. And the Lord would not have Abraham taking any glory for his plan. So when Isaac was a baby and Ishmael a teenager, God asked Abraham to send away Hagar and Ishmael. He promised to provide and take care of Ishmael. He even made a promise that a nation would come from him too, and that's the origin of the Arab nations, in contrast to the Jewish nation that came through Isaac. But Paul proposes this. If God already chose Isaac, why, Galatians, would you choose to be on Team Ishmael? The Galatians had a choice to make, and the implications of their choice were great. Paul finishes this upward climb, and he's at the peak, and he concludes in verse 31. So then, brethren, we are not children of the bondwoman, but of the free. What a declaration to be able to say that you are free. The world longs for freedom. I think about the last few months when I'm recording this with all the COVID lockdowns and all the changes. In those first couple months when everyone was home, I was amazed to see how many people were exploring freedom by getting out and going on walks, going to the park near us. I still saw more people out and about trying to get free from being stuck at home than I've ever seen in our community before. There was an awareness of being stuck, of being in bondage, of being pent up, and they were taking the opportunity to get out. Paul says, we are free if we are not under the bondwoman, but if we're under the free woman. The law offers no freedom. The law offers sin management. Do better, try harder, make changes, work a little more, push one more time, try this plan, try this checklist, all in an effort to be more godly. The end goal is good, to be more godly. But the means of achieving that under the law will always fail. We can make steps, we can make efforts, but we never see true freedom. That's something that only the new covenant and the Spirit can do. Jesus has settled it. Rather than working to get free, we can respond in freedom. In the law, we spent all of our time and energy pedaling uphill. But in grace, we've been transported to the top, helicoptered to the top of the hill. We don't have to bring the bike up at all. The bike is brought up there by the helicopter, and now we're at the top. We can see the view, we can see where we're going, and we get to just enjoy the ride from there. We respond and live forth from there. My works are not to get God's favor when I'm under grace. My works are because I have His grace, I want to respond and do something that brings Him glory. My worship is not to get God's attention when I'm under grace. My worship is a heartfelt response to what God has already done and who God is. My service is not a duty I feel obligated to when I'm under grace, but it's a partnering and desire to be a part of what God is doing. And as we have crested in the book of Galatians, we will look a bit more, starting in the next podcast, at some of the practical application of living in freedom with Jesus. Thank you for pedaling so hard with us through chapters 1 through 4 of the book of Galatians. I know it's been tough. I know it's been thick. But guess what? We're at the point now where Paul's going to totally change his tune. He's put down his gavel. It's his closing arguments there. He says, if you're not going to believe me from this point, then I don't know what else can convince you. But for those who listened in Galatians 1 through 4 that were there in the church in Galatia, those who began to consider and say, yeah, why am I going back to the law? I have something so powerful in grace. He's going to begin to lay out for them some of the true riches that they have, some of the miraculous things that they get to receive because of everything that Jesus did. And that's what we get to do as well. The power of living under grace rather than the exhaustion of living under the law. Hopefully you've been set free through this. The legalism inside of you has died. The little Pharisee in you has died a little bit. If not, I encourage you to go back, listen to some of the podcasts, read through it, but we're going to pick up next week in some of the good stuff. What does this mean for us now that we're truly under grace and no longer under the law? Until then, may the Lord bless you and keep you. I'll see you soon.